Well, where in the world did I put that? Oh, hello. I've just been sitting here working on Charlie's next exhibit. There's always so much to do. There's so many letters to write and people to contact and such. And I had a piece of paper in my hand, an important piece, and I set it down and then got distracted. And now I can't find it. Does that ever happen to you? You put something down and then you look away, and the next thing you know, you've lost it and you have to rack your brain. Maybe I just need a little break. And I would love to tell you some stories about Charlie when he was your age. Charlie had a lot of talent when he was your age, but I think that he had no idea he would make his living as an artist. Charlie didn't like school very much. I assume pretty much you all like school. And even if you don't like it some days are better than others for all of us. But Charlie didn't like school every day because Charlie had a learning disability. It was very difficult for him to learn and well, he didn't know how to ask for help in those days, and the teachers wouldn't have known how to help him, so he just didn't like going to school. And sometimes when he was supposed to be on his way to school, now he'd take his books and he'd put them under a tree or a bush or something, and he'd go off down to the wharf there in St. Louis. The wharf, the dock area where all the boats came. In fact, I have a little map sitting right here. St. Louis, you all know where Montana is, right? Up here. But St. Louis, where Charlie was born, is over here on the great big Mississippi River. And all sorts of other rivers flowing into the Mississippi. And, well, on those rivers were boats. And on those boats were old-timers, old mountain men and fur traders. And, well, they would get off at the docks there in St. Louis and they'd tell stories. Well, Charlie could sit and listen to those stories all day long. Stories about the buffalo in so many numbers out in the West that you could hardly imagine how many there were. And native people, all living like they had for generations. And, well, Charlie wanted to see it because he knew it was changing at that point. The West was changing. Railroads were being built across the West. And, well, when you've got railroads cutting across the land and towns springing up, is there going to be room for all those buffalo to keep running like they had? Or the native people? The native people's lives were changing. And Charlie wanted to see it. You know, he begged his parents to let him go. Of course, they didn't want him to go. He was only 16 years old. How was he going to keep himself? How was he going to feed himself out there in the West? Finally, he pestered them so much. I don't know if you pester your parents a lot, but finally, he gave them such a hard time, they said, fine, you can go. But they thought he'd be back within a year. They thought it would be so difficult. For Charlie, it was like being set free, seeing that land that he dreamed about. And, well, no matter how difficult it got for him, he never, ever thought he'd have to go home for good. So, Charlie got onto a train here in St. Louis, and he took the train all the way across the country to Utah. And then when he got here, now he got onto another train, and then there was some stagecoach travel involved, and he got all the way up here to Helena, Montana. And when Charlie got to Helena, now he bought a wagon, some supplies, some horses to pull it, and then he set off across the prairie to find the Judith Basin, where Charlie's first job in Montana was watching sheep. Charlie doesn't like sheep very much. What's the whole point of having somebody watch the sheep? Well, if you don't watch them, they run off. And Charlie wasn't good at watching sheep. Charlie was in Montana. He wanted to look at the sky and the land and the natural world, and he wanted to draw. And it wasn't long before most of those sheep were gone. And the owner of the sheep was very unhappy with Charlie, and so he fired him. Now what was he going to do? Here's this young kid just sitting in the woods in Montana. Lucky for Charlie, he met a man named Jake Hoover. Now, Mr. Hoover was an old mountain man. He could teach Charlie how to survive in the West. Charlie was a city boy. He didn't know anything about how to find food or make shelter for himself. But old Jake Hoover took Charlie under his wing and helped him learn all of that. After a couple years with Mr. Hoover, Charlie got the job he really wanted, being a cowboy. And Charlie's job with the cow outfit was watching horses at night. So if you think about it now, those cowboys, they work hard all day, and then at night they have to sleep so that they can get up the next morning and work. Well, somebody's got to watch those horses at night so they don't run off. And that was Charlie's job. Think about it. Here we all are in cow camp. There's a fire going, and the cook has the coffee pot sitting there percolating. It's early morning, and those cowboys are stretching awake, and Charlie comes riding in from being out on the prairie all night. Comes riding in, he gets off his horse, comes over and sits down by the fire, warms up his hands a little bit, and maybe he starts telling a funny story of some sort, entertaining everybody in the morning. Or maybe somebody has an old envelope or an old scrap of paper or something, hands that up to Charlie, and a piece of charcoal or something. Charlie makes a little sketch, passes that around. Everybody looks at it and has a good laugh. Or maybe Charlie's got his hands in his pockets. And, well, he was known for this all his life, but in those days now, he'd have his hands in his pockets. People didn't know why. And then he'd pull his hand out of his pocket. And right there in the palm of Charlie's hand would be a little wax model, a little figure of some sort, maybe a horse or a bear. You can't hardly believe that he's been making that in his pocket this whole time without looking. And you reach for it. And just about the time you're going to pick it up, Charlie closes his hand around that wax, rolls it back into a ball, sticks it in his pocket, and makes something else. Charlie was always making art. After a number of years as a cowboy, and Charlie started getting a reputation as an artist. He started being known around the prairies there in Montana. As an artist, he decided he wanted to make his living as an artist. But if Charlie had a lot of talent, he didn't have much sense about business. And if you're going to make a living at something, well, you've got to sell what you make. Charlie didn't know anything about that, and he wasn't inclined to learn. But lucky for Charlie, that's when he met me. Now, my story's a little different from Charlie. This map up here again. I was born on a farm over here in Kentucky. And I grew up in a family that was very poor. I'll be honest with you, I would have loved to have gone to school. I thought going to school would be the greatest adventure of all. Learning about other places and other things and other people. But, as I said, we were poor. We needed all the help we could get there on the farm. So as soon as I was big enough to do anything to help, I was helping in the farm. And then, when I was about 10 years old, my stepfather brought my mother, my half-sister, and me from Kentucky all the way to Montana. A couple of years later, my mother died. And my stepfather took my half-sister and left. He looked at me and he said, "Nancy, you're old enough to figure out what to do for yourself." And so he left me behind. There I was 15 years old, and I didn't have anywhere to go. So You might say to yourself, well, that's not a very happy story. But it happens to be my story. And here's what I've learned about stories. Every story can be seen from a different point of view. And you can look at any story the way you want. So the way I look at my story is this. If that stepfather hadn't brought us west, and if he hadn't left me behind when my mother died, and if I hadn't had to figure out what to do for myself, well, I never would have met Charlie Russell. So there you have it. Sometimes you just have to stick with your story and do your best and see how it comes out. And, well, there I was. Now, I got a job with the Roberts family in Cascade. Oh, they were such a nice family. They were so kind to me. And one night, Mr. Roberts said to me, now, Nancy, we got a friend coming for supper. His name is Charlie Russell, and he's an artist. Well, what do I know about art, coming from where I came from? And I have to admit, I had heard of Charlie Russell there in town. And he was known as a pretty wild cowboy. I didn't know if I wanted to meet him. Dirty and his behavior not very good and such. And, well, have you ever made up your mind about someone or something before you really had the whole story, and then found out later you were terribly wrong? Well, I couldn't have been more wrong about Charlie Russell. He was about the kindest man I had ever met. And when he came for supper that night now, he kept us entertained with stories. Oh my goodness, I was just captured by him and those blue eyes of his. And when he asked if he could come calling, now I said sure. And, well, we spent time walking out by the river there in Cascade, and we took rides out over the prairie. A year later, we were married. So there we were. Charlie, with all that talent, and, well, not a whole lot of sense about business. And me, I don't have any talent that I know of. But I know how to get what I want when I put my mind to it. So I put my mind to learning about business. I learned everything that I could so that I could help my husband. And, well, it turns out I'm pretty good at it.